so much. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and especially because we're going to talk about one of my very favorite things, which is the Black Death, which is kind of a morbid thing to say, I suppose. But as we'll see when we talk about it and think about it today, it's one of the biggest events that ever affected humanity as a whole. So in order to really understand how our society works today, we have to, by definition, consider this particular event. So, what is the Black Death? The Black Death is a very specific outbreak of the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis has the sweet designation of being the only bacteria that I can name off the top of my head because it was so extraordinarily important. The thing to remember about the Black Death when we talk about the Black Death specifically is that if you use the term Black Death, it only refers to the outbreak of bubonic plague that happens between 1346 and 1353. So it's a bit like appellations of names of food, right? So the Black Death only happens from 1346 to 1353. Anything else, that's just sparkling bubonic plague. It's not the same thing. This particular iteration of bubonic plague is particularly interesting because it spreads all the way from China through most of Europe, through Northern Africa, through India, through parts of Indonesia. So it's one of the largest outbreaks of bubonic plague that had ever happened. And it affects the great majority of the world. I think the only continents that are not affected are the Americas and Australasia. That will eventually change, however, in the modern period. So the Black Death, as I'm sure you could kind of understand from a really terrible disease that affects this many places on the earth, ends up killing a quarter of the world's population during this period. So that really helps you kind of put COVID into perspective in a number of ways. Not to say that COVID isn't a terrible situation, but in terms of, pandemics, it's a rather benign one, all things considered. This is also something to kind of keep in mind, because whilst we see that a quarter of the entire world's population dies, it varies from place to place. So in places where we see denser populations, so for example, say some of the Italian city-states like Siena or Florence, we see up to 60% of the population there dying. Whereas the places that are more spread out, where there aren't quite as many people living, it might be a little bit less terrible. So, if you are out on Central Asian steppes, or say you're in Scandinavia, it kills comparatively fewer people. But overall, it is a quarter of the entire world's population. And let us not forget that it hasn't even affected 3 of the continents. So, that is an indication of how many people died. It is important to keep in mind that this is neither the first nor the last time that bubonic plague did occur. So previous incidents include, we think that there were some Neolithic incursions around 3000 BCE. So, for example, we have found some evidence in caves in what is now Sweden that indicate that skeletons there had died of bubonic plague. And we think that that might have been a contributing factor to what we call the Neolithic decline, when there's a kind of sloping off of population there. But we don't know that much because that's sort of the trouble with prehistory in general. We also know that there were outbreaks of bubonic plague in Rome itself before Trajan became emperor. So we've found biological evidence for this, and we do have some records of them saying, ooh, we've got a kind of a terrible disease coming through here. There's also the Justinian plague, which is the first known pandemic of bubonic plague. And the Justinian plague is really quite terrible. I think that it kills a good sort of 10% of the population, especially in and around kind of Rome and Constantinople. So it is a really bad outbreak and incursion. So it's not to say that bubonic plague hadn't been known up to this point, or it hadn't ever occurred before. It's just that this was the worst ever incidence. So why, right? Why is it that the 14th century is a time when bubonic plague was able to kill quite so many people? There are a number of factors. One of them is what we call the Pax Mongolica. So the Pax Mongolica is a term that we use for out in the sort of Asian steppe for the fact that the Khanates at this point had really centralized power, and a lot of the warfare that had been going on in the Central Asian steppes had died down. So this is after Temujin, who you might know as Genghis Khan, has taken over, and the Khanates are really much more settled in terms of what they're doing. So because there are fewer wars and fewer incursions of various armies, things have calmed down, and the overland route of the Silk Road really opens up. Fun fact, when we talk about the Silk Road, it's not just like one road. There are a couple of different routes on the Silk Road. So one of them is by sea, sort of via Indonesia. Another one is through the steppes and, the stans, as we would say now. So when all those conditions really calm down, you have a greater number of caravans that are traversing back and forth over the land route of the Silk Road. And we think that the very first outbreaks of bubonic plague here happen in Uzbekistan, well, what is now Uzbekistan. And we know this because of grave markers that say specifically these people died of this disease. It mentions buboes, and we know that this is a time frame, I think it's about 1345 that this first comes up. Uzbekistan is the center for this because of colonies of marmots that live there. And now I don't want to blame marmots. And one of my pet peeves about Black Death is when people blame rats or blame marmots for the incursions of Yersinia pestis. That is not the case. If you're going to blame any animal for spreading this disease, it's actually fleas. I say that we probably shouldn't be blaming animals one way or another anyway, because it's the actual bacteria that are doing it, not the animals. But these bacteria like to live in the bellies of fleas. And those bellies of fleas were living on the marmots on the Central Asian steppes. And with more and more caravans coming through those colonies of marmots, even if they go run underground and hide, perhaps their fleas have jumping around and they can jump onto your horse, they can jump onto your camel, and they make their way along with the caravans as they come across the continent. So increased trade and more peaceful circumstances means that we were opened up to this place in an area where there were just significantly more Yersinia pestis germs around. Interestingly, Yersinia pestis still pops up in marmot colonies all the time. And indeed, we have bubonic plague outbreaks on every single continent, every single decade, I think, still, with the exception of Australia. And it just doesn't matter anymore because we're really good at it. It's one of the first things that we decided we were going to deal with when we got germ theory. So we can inoculate against it, and antibacterial things work against it really well. So it means absolutely nothing at all whatsoever. But you will occasionally see kind of very purple prose about it in newspapers, and they'll say, "Oh no, the plague is back in Mongolia," and it's like, yeah, okay, it's going to be fine. No one's even going to die. But it's usually because of these marmot colonies. One of the reasons, then, why the bubonic plague is so very difficult in Europe in particular is that Europe had just been coming out of the Great Famine. The Great Famine is another really terrible disaster, and it happens from 1315 to 1317. And this is in a period of when the medieval period is moving out of what we call the medieval warm period, which runs from roughly around 700 to up about the 14th century, when the jet stream was working in such a way that temperatures in Europe had increased in general. At the end of the 14th century, we have then transitioned into what we call the Little Ice Age. And this is a period of several years where temperatures in Europe get considerably colder. So this has a real lasting impact in terms of weather. And one of the things that happens during the Great Famine is that there is extraordinarily cold summers and there are absolute deluges of rain. This ruins crops for 2 years, and we have a significant loss of life just because of famine, which is super unusual in the medieval period. Following the kind of introduction of the three-field system, the horse collar, throughout the medieval period, populations had been massively increasing, and farm technology had got much, much better. So we had actually got really quite good at feeding everyone, and in a way that ancient society, for example, hadn't been able to figure out. But when the Great Famine comes along, there's a massive loss of life. And just the population is kind of like a little bit more sickly, because if you go for a couple of years without really good access to food, it can have a knock-on effect to your health. So also, things are just a little bit unstable in Europe. Another thing that's happening at this time is that there are denser populations, certainly in Europe, not necessarily worldwide, because places like India or China or the Middle East already had super dense populations. We tend to think that Europe is the whole world. It is not. So the kind of urbanized, the re-urbanization process that happens over the course of the medieval period had really hit its peak in the 14th century in terms of what the medieval world was able to do. We have lots more cities around the shop. Because we're so good at farming at this point in time, we're able to do that. So not everybody needs to be farming constantly in order to feed the entire population. So some people can be farming, more people can be living in cities. And we have a lot more cities who are living really with people cheek by jowl. And it's that closeness that allows the bubonic plague to spread. Because although it does kind of transverse to humans initially from fleas, it's extraordinarily infectious. So really just being around another person with bubonic plague is enough to get it. So these are all kind of contributing factors to why this was such a terribly difficult time. So in terms of the spread in Europe in particular, we have really good accounts of how it came in. And as you can see, it kind of comes in over here in around near the Crimea. And it comes directly in through incursions from the Khanates. So in particular, there are a bunch of the Golden Horde who were sieging a city on the Crimean Peninsula. This was led by a guy called Yanni Beg. And they're trying to siege the Crimean Peninsula, which is an extraordinarily important port city. The Crimea is incredibly important for the salt trade. It's incredibly important for the fur trade because a lot of the furs that Europeans like come in from Russia. So it's an extraordinarily important and rich place, which is why the Khanate is interested in doing it. During the siege, we're not sure if this is strictly true or if it's apocryphal, but it's said that the Mongols catapulted bodies that had the plague into the city. So this could be true, in which case it would be one of the first recorded uses of like biological warfare, and it very well might be true. It might also be a way of kind of dehumanizing the Mongols a little bit. It's like, oh, they're so inhuman, they throw bodies over the walls, this sort of thing. We're not actually sure. One way or another, we do know that the plague kind of gets from them into the people in the city, though. So that certainly happens. Interestingly, the horde is eventually called off because we have some deaths of some of the Khans, and so Yanni Beg's got to go back out to Mongolia to go to a big meeting. He takes his army with him. But what happens as a result of all of this is people who are in the city who have ships begin to flee. And specifically in this city, you have a lot of Venetians, you have a lot of Genoese, and you have a lot of Peasants. So people who are from what we call the maritime republics. So they all get in their ships and they're like, that's it, we're out of here. And they then start heading back home. They first stop off at Constantinople, which is where anyone would, the next big Christian city. So they stop off there. Everyone in Constantinople gets the plague. From there, they go towards Greece. They go back to Sicily. They go into Sardinia. The plague jumps off there. Then it starts getting into all of the ports that are usually trading with those people. So your first incursions really in Europe and North Africa are in kind of like your traditional Mediterranean ports. So on the boot itself of Italy, Northern Africa, the Levant and the kind of Outremer, so the places like Jerusalem, Damascus, they all suffer these things because that's where we have really established trade routes. So when things are moving back and forth, it's the ports that get hit the first. Then it spreads out from there, then it spreads out from there. So eventually, it's just kind of everywhere in Europe by the time you get to the 1350s. But it follows specific patterns of trade. And you can actually really see specifically the way that everybody writes about it, exactly when the plague comes in and how it comes in. So, in some places we will know a specific shipment of salt is what brought it in. So everyone has a really keen idea of what's happening here and everyone is recording it. So how do medieval people react to this? This is a time before germ theory. And when I say it's time before germ theory, a thing that I want you to keep in mind is that germ theory is extraordinarily new. We did not come up with it until the 19th century. So there tends to be a way of relating to medieval people as though they're very stupid. that they just simply couldn't come up with germ theory. And if that's true, then everyone in the Enlightenment is stupid too, because they still believed in humoral theory. They still believed exactly the same thing that medieval people believed. It's not until we really invented microscopes that we figured out about germs, because it's kind of really difficult to think that there are kind of a lot of little living things crawling around on all of us that we can't see. So let's not think that medieval people are any less intelligent than we are for not being able to know right away that what they were seeing was a bacterial outbreak. But they have some really sophisticated ways of relating to it. So here I've got some quotes from the Paris Medical Faculty from 1347. And the University of Paris was one of the most important universities in the medieval period. It was the second university ever established after Bologna. In particular, it was sort of known for doctrinal theory and philosophy, but it did have a very good medical faculty as well. And when all of this is happening, the King of France kind of goes to them and says, all right, I'm going to need you to explain how it is that we're suffering through this terrible plague right now. And they come up with this very interesting scientific answer. It's got multiple parts to it, but the first part they say is that we say that the distant and first cause of this pestilence was and is the configuration of the heavens. In 1345, at 1 hour afternoon on the 20th of March, there was a major conjunction of 3 planets in Aquarius. This conjunction, along with other earlier conjunctions and eclipses, by causing a deadly corruption of the air around us, signifies mortality and famine, and also other things about which we will not speak here because they are not relevant. Aristotle testifies that this is the case in his book concerning the courses of the properties of the elements, and this is found in ancient philosophers and Albertus Magnus in his book concerning the causes and the properties of the elements. Says that the conjunction of Mars and Jupiter causes a great pestilence in the air, especially when they come in a hot, wet sign, as was this case in 1345. For Jupiter, being wet and hot, draws up evil vapors from the Earth and Mars, because it is moderately hot and dry, and then ignites the vapors, and as a result there were lightning, sparks, noxious vapors, and fires throughout the air. So this really explains to us a lot about the medieval worldview. So the world in general is conceived of as being a divine creation. And it's really seen that the heavens are connected very much to what's happening on Earth. A huge importance is placed on astronomy at all times, as well as astrology. The two are not really differentiated between at this particular point in time. And indeed, it's one of what we call the quadrivium. So if you go to university, you learn the trivium first, which is logic, grammar, and rhetoric. And then after you graduate from that, if you become a master, you learn music, mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. So these learned medical professionals, what they say is like, okay, well, the first thing that you need to do is you need to look at the stars in order to understand what's happening on Earth, because these two things are connected. And you can see them applying humoral theory here. So it's saying, okay, well, Aquarius, this is a hot and wet sign. Mars is a hot and dry planet. When these things get together, it creates a poisonous vapor. And it's that poisonous vapor that is what is causing all of this. So that's the first part. The second part is how that vapor then moves. So they say, yet we still regard illnesses proceeding from the corruption of the air as much more dangerous. This is because bad air is more noxious than food or drink in that it can penetrate quickly to the heart and lungs to do its damage. We believe that the present epidemic or plague has arisen from corrupt air into its substance and has not changed in its attributes. By which we wish it to be understood that air being pure and clear by nature can only become putrid or corrupt being mixed with something else, that is to say, with evil vapors. What happened was that the many vapors which had been corrupted at the time of the conjunction were drawn up from the earth and water, and were then mixed with the air and spread abroad by frequent gusts of wind in the wild southerly gales. And because of these alien vapors which they carried, the winds corrupted the air in its substance and are still doing so. And this corrupted air, when breathed in, necessarily penetrates to the heart and corrupts the substance of the spirit there and rots the surrounding moisture. And the heat thus caused destroys the life force, and this is the ultimate cause of the present epidemic. So this is quite interesting, because what they're saying here is that there's air that is corrupt in and of itself, and that's the thing that gives you the Black Death. And that is really quite close, actually, to what germs sort of do. So the idea is that there's something in the air that is contagious, that is infection, and that is the thing that's going to kill you. So they're not obviously right about how bacteria work, but they do really have a clear sense of the fact that there's something in general in the air we breathe, in the way that we relate to each other, that makes you sick, and that's what kills you. So it's not just like, oh, evil spirits or anything like that. There are sophisticated ways of looking at this that allow us to see that medieval people are really grappling with this, and they come up with something that is not too far off from what is actually the truth, if we consider the fact that germs aren't going to get discovered for another 400 years or so. Yeah. So you can understand that there are some huge societal reactions to something like this. So we have a report from Siena in 1348 where Agnolo di Turo says, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another. For this illness seemed to strike through their breath and sight, and so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with a multitude of dead. And they died by the hundreds, both day and night. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Turo, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world." So it's all well and good to kind of look at this as something that is completely at arm's length. But this is absolutely horrifying. This, understand, like in a particularly religious world and a particularly Christian world, the rights of the dead are a really important part of dealing with life. There is a tendency to think about medieval people as though they didn't care about death at all, which is a complete and utter myth. They aren't just saying, oh, well, we're all going to die. No one is resigned to that idea except in circumstances like this. And as good Christians, one of the things that they really want to do is take care of their dead. And this is, a site of profound grief and loss for them, being unable to do that. Now, there are some interesting things that we've learned through archaeological excavations now. So, for example, here in London, we found a big plague pit over in Spitalfields when new office blocks were being built. So right near Spitalfields Market, if you're in London, you can go have a look. They actually have the foundations of a church there now, and it's where a bunch of plague pits were found. And what we found is that although there were certainly plague pits that were full of lots of dead bodies, they're not just chucked in there. Actually, we see that all the bodies are lined up one way next to each other, and then you have a layer of lime and dirt, and then you have the bodies are then laid in another pattern on top of that. So everyone is still very carefully laid to rest. There's still a lot of worry about their bodies and respect for their bodies, but there isn't the ability to build a single grave for just one person in particular. And that's in London, where things were not as bad as in Siena. So the Italian city-states are some of the worst hit. Some of the Hanseatic port towns in Germany are also really badly, they're dealt really bad blows. Here it is bad, but it's not quite as bad as it is in Italy. So there is this real profound grief about not even being able to engage with grief, engage with the religious ceremonies that would help you deal with something like this. Losing all 5 of your children is absolutely a horrifying thing. And it's really important for us to remember too, again, there's one of these very pervasive myths about the medieval period that nobody cared about their kids. But here Agnolo is telling you how awful it was for him to lose his entire family. So there is an instinct within this as well. Something that we see during this period is that a lot of people think that this is just the end times. They think that this is, the pestilence part of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, that this means that we're coming into the end of the world. And there is a real appetite for preaching at this point that is about Antichrist or the apocalypse. And there is a big way of dealing with it, which is like, well, I guess this is it. Especially in a Christian society where Christianity is a linear religion. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we're all seen as sort of being in the middle and moving towards an inevitable end when the apocalypse happens. And so Christians who are really plugged into that worldview will see an event like this as being, a heralding of the last days. A big, terrible thing that happens also is, on a popular level, the persecution of Jewish people and also more broadly of travelers, people who are moving between place to place. So it's all well and good for, the Paris medical faculty to say, oh, the thing that started the plague is, corrupted air. And now it's just kind of moving around, and that's how you get sick. Some people are not particularly content with that. And there springs up this popular accusation that Jewish people, or people who are traveling more generally, are poisoning wells of water. As a result of this, we see a number of pogroms throughout the period. So Jewish people at this point live more specifically on the continent. By this point, they've been completely expelled from England. The expulsion of the Jewish people in England had already happened a couple of centuries prior, so there were no Jewish people here to blame, and yet it happened anyway. But Jewish people live in what are the German city-states, in a lot of the Italian places. In Spain, there's a huge population. In what's now the Czech Republic, huge population. And they are a sort of ready scapegoat for Christians. Medieval Christians did like to blame Jews for a lot of things. They see Jewish people as being necessarily antagonistic towards Christian society. So they were attacking Jewish populations with relative regularity. Sometimes Jewish populations would be attacked simply if Christians got into too much debt with them, because only Jewish people were allowed to lend money. And in fact, Jewish people were forced to lend money in the medieval period. They are killed with routine frequency. For example, when people go on crusades, they often just kill a few Jewish people on the way. And then they were the subject of pogroms and burnt at the stake frequently during this particular iteration of the Black Death. It becomes such a problem that the Pope steps in. So Pope Clement VI was forced to announce that it cannot be true that the Jews, by such a heinous crime, are the cause or occasion of the plague, because through many parts of the world, the same plague, by the hidden judgment of God, has afflicted and afflicts the Jews themselves and many other races who have never lived alongside them. So the Pope's coming through here with just an observable fact, which is that Jewish people too are suffering from the plague, and everywhere is suffering from the plague. So it can't possibly be due to Jewish people doing the wrong thing. But there is this kind of knee-jerk response of blaming the other in the medieval period. And so we do see a lot of people who are just traveling place to place killed by mobs, and we see a lot of Jewish people who are the direct objects of violence. There is also a big thing about just the idea of conceptions of sin here. So what Pope Clement VI says there is that this is the judgment of God, actually. And God has brought about the plague because of the sins of the earth. Now, who believes in what sort of sins really varies from place to place, and the blame gets put in a lot of different places. So, for example, here in England, Thomas Brinton, the Bishop of Rochester, writes a series of sermons which are absolutely amazing, where he blames the plague on people dressing too sexily. And he says that the reason that the plague has occasioned upon the earth is that guys are wearing shoes that are too pointy and hose that are too tight. And so God thinks that's entirely too sexy, and so he's punishing us all. You will then also see, on the other hand, individuals like, for example, John Wycliffe here in England says, well, the plague is a reaction from God to the sins of the church. So the church itself has become a sinful institution. It's full of people who are just seeing it as a career, and they're not really caring about the souls of the people that are in their care. And so God is punishing the world because of what is going on with the church. Then there are people who just say, okay, well, God is just saying that the world is sinful as a whole. And if what God is doing is punishing us for sin, maybe we can get out in front of the plague and we can stop the plague by punishing ourselves corporeally, so that you don't have to have the plague to do that. You can do it yourself. And these groups are called the flagellants. The flagellants come up more specifically in the lowlands, so places like what's now Belgium, what is now the Netherlands. We see them in Germany, and we do see them in some places in northern Italy as well. And so this is an eyewitness account that was reported to Robert of Avesbury about them. And he says, in that same year of 1349, about Michaelmas, over 600 men came to London from Flanders, mostly of Zealand and Holland origin. Sometimes at St. Paul's and sometimes at other points in the city, they made 2 daily public appearances wearing clothes from the thighs to the ankles, but otherwise stripped bare. Each wore a cap marked with a red cross in front and behind. Each had in his right hand a scourge with 3 tails. Each tail had a knot, and through the middle of it there were sometimes sharp nails fixed. They marched naked in a file, one behind the other, and whipped themselves with these scourges on their naked and bleeding bodies. 4 of them would chant in their native tongue, and another 4 would chant in response, like a litany. Since they would all cast themselves on the ground in this sort of procession, stretching out their hands like the arms of the cross. The singing would go on, and the one who was in the rear of those thus prostrate acting first, each of them in turn would step over the others and give one stroke with his scourge and the man lying under him. This went on from the first to the last until each of them had observed the ritual to the full tale of those on the ground. Then each put on his customary garments, and always wearing their caps and carrying their whips in their hands, they retired to their lodgings. It is said that every night they performed the same penance. So this is a big kind of communal way of relating to the plague. One of the hallmarks of medieval society is that it's extraordinarily communal. And it's really, really interested in public displays of religiousness, generally piety, and certainly in terms of atonement. So one of the ways that crime is really looked at in the medieval period is as something that is shameful. So one of the most common ways that crimes are punished is just that you kind of have to sit in a chair and people make fun of you, and everybody knows that you've done something sinful. So the flagellants are doing the same sort of thing. So they are going in front of the biggest populations that they can, and they're saying, we're sinful, we're punishing ourselves. We are going to take this on for everybody so that God will stop punishing us all with the plague. There are a lot of ways of relating to this. A lot of people just kind of think this is nuts. So Robert of Avebury here is really saying that he's not so sure that this is a great call. There are a lot of rumors about the flagellants. A lot of people were indicating that when, especially on the continent, if they were traveling from place to place, they would camp when they did. There were a lot of rumors that they were kind of having orgies and that sort of a thing in the woods because, they're half naked anyway and they're crazy people. Who knows what they're up to? And the church absolutely hates this. The church really is not a huge fan of large groups of people coming up with an idea about sin and saying that they can get out in front of this without mediation from religion. So there was a lot of pushback to it. But this went on for quite a few years, and then it just suddenly dries up. And we're not exactly quite sure why they reigned in the flagellation, but it is a hallmark, especially in Northern Europe, of the relationship that people have to the plague. One of my favorite sources for information about the plague comes from Boccaccio's Decameron. And Boccaccio's Decameron is an absolutely wonderful book that you should really read because it's very, very funny. And I recommend it to everyone. But it is a story that comes about because it centers around a bunch of noble people who have fled Florence and they've gone into the countryside to wait out the plague, and they're very bored and hanging out in a manor house being rich. And while they are doing that, they decide to tell themselves stories. So the entire preamble is written from Boccaccio's own experience of the plague in Florence. And he relates that there are people in the country who react to the plague in particular ways. One of the first are people who kind of go into what we would call self-isolation. And he says, there were some people who thought that living moderately and avoiding any excess might help a great deal in resisting the disease. And so they gathered in small groups and lived entirely apart from everyone else. They shut themselves up in those houses where there were no sick people and where one could live well by eating the most delicate of foods and drinking the finest of wines, doing so always in moderation, allowing no one to speak out about or listen to anything said about the sick and dead outside. These people lived, entertaining themselves with music and other pleasures that they could arrange. So this is interesting because Boccaccio talks about these people. But these people are obviously very wealthy, right? So if you can afford to just lock yourself in your house and live off of your wine stash and get some musicians in, then yeah, you can go ahead and have a perfectly nice time. But it's interesting because it shows us that medieval people do have a real idea about contagion and the idea that this is infectious. So they know that if they come into contact with other people who are ill, they run the risk of getting ill themselves. So they're just going to isolate. They're going to make sure that they don't come into contact with these people. And when they talk about delicate foods and fine wines, these are really understood by medieval people as, forms of moderation that will make you more robust. So eating the correct diet. It's like the people now who think that, if they exercise, then they are going to be able to kind of ward off COVID. It's a similar form of thinking. So it's saying, okay, I'm going to retreat into this way. I'm going to make sure I don't have any contact with the outside world. And I am going to regulate myself in such a way that I can assure that I myself will be healthy. Then there is what I call the Yolo approach, which is to say there are a certain number of people who went, well, we only live once. We're all going to die anyway. And what Boccaccio says about them is others thought the opposite. They believed that drinking excessively, enjoying life, going about singing and celebrating, satisfying in every way the appetite as best one could, laughing and making light of everything that happened was the best medicine for such a disease. So they practiced to the fullest what they believed by going from one tavern to another all day and night, drinking to excess, and they would often make merry in private homes, doing everything that pleased or amused them the most. This they were able to do easily, for everyone felt that he was doomed to die, and as a result abandoned his property, so that most of the houses had become common property, and any stranger who came upon them used them as if they were their rightful owner. So this is interesting because it shows us a couple things, right? So on the one hand, there are people who are like, well, screw it. If I'm going to die, I'm going to have a nice time. I'm going to the pub. Another thing that it shows us is how great the amount of mortality actually was. So there are all these empty houses that people can just go into and party in if they wish to. And part of that is probably mortality, just people dying, but part of it is also people who fled the city in general, right? So Boccaccio is writing this about, as a Florentine who flees the city and about Florentines who flee the city. So there are also these empty houses where it's just kind of understood that you can go in there because their owners are off in the countryside avoiding this. So there is a way of relating to this where it's just like, well, you only live once, right? Then he talks about the sort of third way. And he says, many others adopted a middle course between the two attitudes just described. Neither did they restrict their food and drink so much as the first group, nor did they fall into such dissoluteness that drunkenness as the second. Rather, they satisfied their appetites to a moderate degree. They did not shut themselves up, but went around carrying in their hands flowers or sweet-smelling herbs of various kinds of spices. And they would often put these things on their noses, believing that such smells were a wonderful means of purifying the brain, for all the air seemed infected with the stench of dead bodies, sickness, and medicines. So there are other people who are like, yeah, well, we're just going to go about our lives in the way that you have to. And their protection against it is holding bunches of herbs against their face. So if the thing that's making you ill is bad air, bad smells, miasma, you can counteract that by having sweet smells in front of your face. So we often see that people would recommend, for example, putting lavender or sage in front of their noses to ward this off. And it's actual bunches of herbs. Very unfortunately, there are no plague doctor masks during the Black Death. If you've ever seen those images of the big bird-looking guy, that is specifically from the 17th century plague and only in Italy. So if you ever see anybody with a plague doctor mask, they have inadvertently, and they're saying that it's a Black Death, they've got that wrong. It is still bubonic plague, but it is the modern iteration of the plague. And as we all know, that is not the Black Death. There are some knock-on effects of all of this. So you see a lot of social upheaval that comes as a part of this. In France, we see the Jacquerie Revolt, which happens in 1358. And later here in London, you will see the English Peasants Revolt in 1381. And in general, the thing about both of these is that it is uprising of the common people against the nobility because of their social station and their lack of mobility within that. We have to understand that in medieval Europe, 80% of the population are peasants and 70% of those peasants are serfs, which means that they're unfree. So if you're a serf, you can't decide where you live. You have to have permission to marry who you want. There are all these various constraints on how your life is. Because people are dying everywhere, there are suddenly much fewer people to do the same amount of work of keeping everyone alive. And wages have not increased at all as a result of this. So there are fewer people doing more work, and there were laws brought in to say that peasants can't actually ask for any more money. So we know that the Bishop of Winchester at the moment is paying peasants per day. When the plague kind of breaks out, he's paying them about 15 denarii per day for work. The peasants don't like this, and they say, okay, well, this is just a supply and demand issue, and you can't treat us like this. And so there are multiple revolts. The Peasants Revolt here, they are listening to apocalyptic preaching by the preacher John Ball. They're led by a guy called Watts Hyler. They meet up on Blackheath, they listen to a bunch of sermons, and they come into London the next day, and they storm the city and make a great deal of progress. They burn down the Savoy Palace. They let everybody out of jail, because jail is where debtors are put at the time. It's not really people who commit crimes. It's just people who are in debt. And instead of stealing things, a lot of the time they burn them all, because they're trying to make this point that they don't actually care about worldly goods. What they want is a more equal society. The rebellion is eventually crushed, and King Richard II says of it, rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably harsher. And I bring this up because there is a myth about the Black Death as this huge turning point in social progress. And people say, oh, well, because there were fewer people to do actual work, it means that they got paid more for the work that they did. There's a reason for this, and that's because we do see wages go up slightly after the Peasants' Revolt here in England. So as I say, they were getting paid about 15 denarii a day, and that then goes up to about 17 denarii after the Peasants' Revolt. Thing about that is it then stagnates completely. So the same 17 denarii a day that is granted to the peasants after all of this holds true for another 110 years at the very least. So it's one thing to say, oh, well, the peasants got more money. And it's like, well, they sort of did. But I mean, if you were still being paid exactly the same amount of money for your job with inflation and all things considered as someone was getting paid 100 years ago, you're still in poverty, right? And what Richard II says here is certainly true. So yes, the peasants do manage to revolt, but they are crushed inordinately. There are a number of laws that are promulgated specifically in England to say that you are still going to remain a serf. You can't ask for higher wages. There are a number of laws that say, okay, that's it. These wages are fixed now. And that really does hold true until well into the modern period. So we like to look at this and say, oh, well, actually, there was an opportunity for ordinary people to make a bit more money. And while that's kind of true, it's much, much too simplistic. So there is a momentary jump up in prices for wages, but it then stagnates and nothing much comes of it. So I don't want anyone going away from this talk thinking that things necessarily got better for the common person as a result of this. So that is a whole lot of information that I have given you about the Black Death, but I wanted to leave the floor open for questions as well. I'd like to thank you all once again for having me here, and do let me know if there's anything in particular that you'd like to know more about.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Yes, that was wonderful. I'm just going to turn off the recording because we don't normally record the questions.
Of course.
So